Hello, this is our SPEC 619 ethical presentation on telehealth and ABA. Moving on to our intro slide. Let me just minimize us. So we have 5 people in our group. Our first person is Marvette. She lives in Eugene, Oregon. She works at a ABA clinic as an RBAI. She has experience, 7 years of experience. I am Michaela Dowley. I live in Jackson, Michigan. I worked as an in-home behavior technician for 1.5 years, and now I have been working in a clinical setting for 1.5 years. Cass lives in South Bend, Indiana. She works as an ABA in an ABA clinic as a supervising and training RBT. She has been in the field for 5 years. Kaylee lives in Columbus, Ohio. She works as an in-home behavior technician and an ABA trainer. She's been in the field for 2 years. Samia lives in Warren, Michigan. She works as a resident behavior technician at an autism clinic. Marvette and I have experience with telehealth in all forms, such as ABA telehealth with the BCBA, parent training, supervision with the BCBA, and telehealth meetings. Cass and Kaylee have experience with a speech therapist doing telehealth with their clients. On to the next slide. The professional and ethical dilemmas involved on either side. So the questions we're going to be answering is professional guidelines and telehealth. Is telehealth acceptable to ABA and to school districts in the area of the pandemic, the era of the pandemic? What rules were established and what ramifications did the pandemic have on students, parents, and school staff? How to teach a child who may have not been properly evaluated due to the isolation of COVID-19. In this presentation, we will start off with Samia. Samia will start out with this presentation by discussing the pros of telehealth and how it can be an effective means to ABA. And then Marvette will transition to discussing the cons to telehealth and where there might be an ethical dilemma. Following that, Cass will discuss our position, and finally, Kaylee will discuss the ethics that could be affected by telehealth, and she will answer the frequently asked questions. I also want to point out that we have color-coded our presentation slides to identify who is discussing the topic. On to our next slide. Let me try to get everybody up here. So this is our first picture or image to discuss. And this is a table that we found in a source that discusses like the domains that could be affected by telehealth, which is the therapist suitability, the client suitability, standards of care in the delivery of telehealth services, informed consent, which you can see at the very bottom of that. And then the next slide follows that, which that talks about data confidentiality, testing, assessment, and legal aspects. And then we have another image of just a whole bunch of literature that it talks about the related theme of ethics and telehealth, and it talks about the domains, or like talks about the benefits, the consent, the confidentiality, the IRB, ethics, security, privacy, safety, HIPAA, laws, beliefs, legal aspects, respect, rights, risks, and conflict of interests. And now we will move on to Samia talking about some pros.
Hi everyone, this is Samiha. So I'll be talking about the pro side. So just like everything in life has pros and cons, so does the telehealth. Telehealth can be a potential solution to provide AVA service beyond the traditional face-to-face model, especially in areas where there is lack of professionals or there are shortages. In articles by Horn et al. And Lindgren et al., telehealth can reduce the service cost by up to half compared to in-person therapy. In another article by Salomon, telehealth is viewed favorably by busy parents and caregivers living in rural areas. And telehealth also served as an effective platform for parent training and increased both parents' knowledge and implementation skills.
All right, now moving on to Marvet.
Hi, I'm Marvet, and I want to talk about the political, economic, financial, and societal factors and considerations with telehealth. Telehealth services can be provided, for example, through audio, text messaging, or video communication technology. It can include video conferencing software, and for the purposes of certain payers, it could include Medicare and Medicaid. The notification of enforcement discretion for telehealth remote communications during the COVID-19 nationwide public health emergency. The Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services is responsible for enforcing certain regulations issued under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, which is HIPAA. And they were able to go ahead and get telehealth as an emergency covered health care provider that wanted to use audio and video communications and technology to provide telehealth patients services through the COVID-19 pandemic. Mask mandates were confusing at the time due to political strife. There were areas of confusion from political leaders regarding masks and vaccines, and there were no vaccines at the time for children. So there was a concern about health effects to the staff providing in-person care. So we went to telehealth. What considerations were the licensing regarding those that are providing services. And one of the important factors by Kaysen and Brannon is there a need to secure licenses in 2 states if you are practicing in one and your client is in another? And current medical and legal practices dictated that the location of the client is what determines the state in which the practitioner must be licensed. So if you're not licensed in that state, you might have to get a license that would provide you to be able to be a provider for telehealth at that time. Additionally, the Department of Defense, the DoD, and the Veterans Health Administration having their own licensing requirements and credentialing and privileging processes because they operate on federal property such as military installations, VA hospitals, etc. Practitioners must hold installations and licensures in VA hospitals. They also must hold it in one of the United States of America, the District of Columbia, or US territories, and they must be credentialed through an authentication process to validate qualifications through the DoD or the VHA. Important steps in the development, evaluation, and dissemination of the telehealth programs were having the parents provide therapy while they were directed online by a BCBA or an RBT. The important steps in this were that were some parents willing to be able to provide such services, as well as parents being able to handle children that may or may not have dangerous behaviors. The concerns about HIPAA compliance while using telehealth are in the websites listed on this slide. And if you need any more information on the notification of enforcement discretion, its link is there as well. Next slide. So here are some costs that we want to talk about today. As you can see, in-home therapy can be more expensive than telehealth, and clinic telehealth is remarkably more expensive than home telehealth. The challenge is staffing. Would you have staff that could handle in certain lengths of telehealth as far as 3-hour sessions? Are you able to have a child and a parent that are able to use that 3-hour block for telehealth and for providing in-home healthcare? When you do go in the home, you were required to wear masks, remove your shoes, wash your hands frequently, using hand sanitizer. So there were also those added expenses with in-home for telehealth, as well as clinical telehealth situations. In a clinic that I'm familiar with, they had single rooms with single therapists with one client only, and there were no interactions across the facility. Next slide. The normalcy and the theatrical perspectives relevant to the disability. As we went through the COVID-19, and we are still going through COVID-19, there were new normals with masks. So you're thinking about situations like parents having you do a coax. A coax was a real struggle for some of the telehealth providers, as it is a challenge to be able to teach a child to say ah, ooh, e, ah, and to watch your lips from a video screen. So that could cause a certain problem for the child that may or may not have a higher functioning version of autism. The Council of Autism Services Providers provided an extensive PDF regarding the pandemic. It's an interesting read. If you get a chance to read it, go to this website. As telehealth gains the momentum of a service delivery model in the United States, it can become a regulatory and legal issue. Questions are arise in that situation. Basically, ABA providers were having to look at the ethical and evidence-based practices in accordance with the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code of Behavior Analysts of the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, hereafter referred to as the BACB. But the use of telehealth during the COVID-19 pandemic might raise unique ethical challenges, such as, is a parent able to provide proper care, not having a foundation in ABA? The systemic research focused on development and improvement of implementations of ASD services, which leads us to believe that it's an innovative area for research. Use of telehealth programs could be used to train parents to implement intervention with guide of BCBA or an registered behavior technician. Some problems with this is self-injurious behavior and behaviors that may cause destruction, including said computer. Next slide. Labeling and placement of eligibility criteria is a struggle. Can you properly evaluate a child with a VB map or with any other assessment needs without having a parent be familiar with how to do those assessments? Having a Zoom meeting for a child with all parties that are involved is beneficial, but not all parties during the COVID-19 were able to function as a team. So challenges were, can you have the parent, the child, the BCBA, the school staff, the support staff, the RBTs be able to all meet and be on the same page and communicate effectively for the benefit of the child? Also, are there behaviors that could happen after the COVID-19 pandemic when the children were not socialized with others? So we're talking about social skills could be a problem, and that can lead into gray areas of effective eligibility criteria. Legal considerations with the placement of the licensure of the practitioner. We're talking about malpractice policies for services delivered through telehealth. Will insurance companies find a loophole and decide not to cover the telehealth ABA practices? Parents can indicate that it's more engagement in the intervention with their child, but oftentimes they do not have the foundational knowledge of ABA and why we're doing what we're doing. And so there can be legal ramifications for that, especially when you move a child from telehealth back into clinical sites or into school situations. Next slide. Funding issues related to the teaching and licensure of BCBA preparation. We had many teachers that left the field during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are finding staff shortages and issues with people wanting to be in the field at all due to low pay. Education and RBT pay has not stuck with the inflation rates. Also, people find that if you're using telehealth, you might not necessarily need to pay a living wage. And I work for a clinic of people that are Ball State graduates. They went ahead and started the ABA clinic that I work at in the heat of the pandemic. That's July of 2020. And we have seen some successes, but then we have also seen some downfalls as kids have returned to school. We were also having some gray areas with the fact that we were using our 3-hour blocks with the students and having to be online with a class and other class members while we were doing our ABA therapies. Some support staff was not on board with the same things that were happening in our ABA clinic, and concerns were coming up regarding how we taught certain lessons. We have to have a need to secure the licensure in states where the practitioner is licensed, but we need to think about when their children are in and what state they're in. Parents can implement the ASD techniques with fidelity and proper training from a BCBA, but we BCBAs have to have a master's degree, and we have to have gone through certain amounts of training and on-the-job training, whereas parents are just parents and they are doing the best they can. Next slide.
Hi, so again, my name is Cass. I'm going to kind of summarize some of what Marvette said as well, but I'm going to take more of a position on the, as our group kind of went through this. We found that it was very arguable between the two stances of whether we felt that telehealth was truly ethical or unethical. So I'm going to present to you some ideas that with those all of those things in mind. So we see many learners come through clinics and not all are offered services. A clinician may feel that there are enough skill, there aren't, a clinician may feel that there are enough skill deficits, aren't enough skill deficits to offer full-time services. So a parent is turned to schools and relying on the strength of, if there even is any, supports that are offered to their children with special needs through that school. And there are some additional problematic variables in this situation. It's widely known, especially with the pandemic at hand, what an impact that took on our economic status. And schools right now are severely underfunded and understaffed, which means additional support systems see a lot of cuts from their programs. And these learners are then thrust into whatever grade suits their age and not their skill level. Now, there's already a need for additional teaching for this student. However, because their skill deficits, they find themselves on the cusp of needing services and thus are forced to rely on any IEP or 504 plans and really ultimately the school's adherence to it or ability to adhere to it due to staffing and funds. So by providing services through telehealth, this opens up these kinds of students to individual services and the additional supports necessary to allow them to succeed educationally, where they may have just fallen through the cracks of the school system otherwise. When we also think from a parent and guardian perspective, COVID-19 has caused huge challenges when it comes to properly assessing a learner. Seclusion, as a result of this, has asked clinicians to extend ways to train parents in a far more in-depth way than ever before. These parents are now asked to act as quasi-therapists through the telehealth supports. This means a clinician must ensure they are constantly assessing the individual just as we would in a clinic to make sure they are not missing anything or improperly implementing interventions due to the curb of that virtual barrier that happens when the clinician isn't in person. The way to placate this challenge to keep parents as deeply trained and vigilant as they could possibly be is by deepening this training. Now, they must be more privy than ever before to our intervention methods in order to make these interventions that they're doing and regular assessments as viable as possible. This is about ensuring the learner has every possibility for success in learning through this method of teaching. I know it can be hard to consider sending your child to school. I've seen it time and again with students from my clinic, and they may not have the skills for school. They may not be ready. And I have heard parents in my clinical settings expressing their fears of their child attending school in which he is not ready for because insurance cut his funding. They then consider working from home and homeschooling their child, but this then makes them not only a parent, but a teacher and then a therapist all at the same time. This amount of expectation for a parent can be insurmountable. These parents end up hampered by providing special education services themselves, in addition to many other aspects they are juggling. But telehealth offers us an opportunity to provide exposure to ABA services in a manner that is more feasible and appropriate for this type of learner. Now, this opens a door for support in an appropriate dosage for learners who may not require a full-time spot at a clinic. These learners, their needs, and their families still count. So I want to talk about our next slide, and it's going to discuss some counterpoints, right? So we find ourselves with some areas for concern with telehealth. These expectations that are put on these parents is a weighty one and must not be considered lightly. Now, parents must be able to provide proper services in the home with the aid of telehealth sessions. It is vital that as a clinician, we ensure that those interventions are properly executed, meaning proper training is vital. However, due to some extent, we must consider the abilities of the parents and thus their likelihood to execute programming as needed. Now, on this next slide, I'm going to drop in a graph here, and you can kind of see it's actually a case, and this is a nice little line graph of a client's name, Connor, that we found through a research article. And Connor's behaviors are self-injurious, and we find that with the results of an FA, conclude that most of his functions are attention-based. Now, these cases of SIBs, in which Connor experiences, can require a large amount of adult attention at this point, like in a case such as this one, right? So we can see there's variable amounts of attention-seeking behaviors that are shown in a topography of SIBs. Now, how can we now, these cases of SIBs can require a large amount of adult attention. And in this case, how can that's asking a lot of this parent. Now, parents are not typically formally trained. So how can we expect these parents to know how to intervene in a structured way without some sort of formal training? Some behaviors are difficult for parents to work through because separating yourself from that parent role in that moment can be massively challenging. We're going to move back to the next slide, and it's going to be more about how we will see some more counterpoints. Now, telehealth is a new frontier for ABA. The need is higher as our current pandemic keeps away more people in their homes than ever before. However, there are many variables that come into play, and if it's not monitored properly, and they can cross many big ethical boundaries. While these services can be provided in clinic and out of clinic, it's ultimately the client's environment of choosing sometimes, and this can raise concern for HIPAA compliance and privacy issues. I mean, a person's computer and internet can be hacked. It happens every day. And if proper protections are not in place, these clients' medical information can be far more accessible to those without permissions. And many families concerned with HIPAA compliance, having their children on the internet, may cause apparent stress without having full ethical considerations addressed. Another area for concern in telehealth is telehealth's accessibility for those who may be low income or even couldn't afford the proper technology it's accessibility for those who are in maybe low income or even living in rural areas. I actually grew up in a low income family in a rather rural location. We couldn't afford proper technology to even hold a video conference, let alone the Wi-Fi we would need to stream, which did not reach my home's location. There were no internet services, in fact, that offered coverage in our home's location. So what happens to the clients who are in this situation, turned away from a clinic, not ready for school, but can't reach these supports as telehealth can? So what would have happened to a client who was in the situation that I would have been in had I required the services? So in those ways, we have to remember that telehealth may not be a fit or ethical in that way for every learner. And we'll move on to our next here.
Hi, I'm Kaylee. To conclude our presentation or debate, we discussed many pros and cons of ABA delivered through telehealth. Some cons included the difficulty for families without internet access or limited technology. Continuous monitoring is required. It is more difficult to maintain ethical compliance due to the technological footprint telehealth leaves. the cost effectiveness issues and funding for internet and technology provided to the clients, and an increase of reliance on parents during telehealth because parents essentially become a teacher or therapist themselves. Some pros were that telehealth can be cost and time effective. It is less difficult to maintain ethical compliance in terms of multiple relationships or lack of closeness with family due to interactions being solely through video. More flexibility for parent trainings and staff trainings to keep up with busy work schedules and other life factors, and the convenience of services being still provided through illnesses such as pandemics like COVID-19. On the next slide, there are a list of ethical codes that should be considered when conducting ABA therapy via telehealth. A few to highlight are code 2.06, maintaining confidentiality. HIPAA has strict guidelines concerning client confidentiality and sharing of information. Even with safeguards for virus and malware protection, data can still be breached. Code 2.11 serves records and data. HIPAA compliance does not always protect against hackers and data breaches while telehealth is being conducted. Oftentimes, clients or the client's families are recording data and sending it across the web. This also serves storing and maintaining records, which is code 2.07. Even though technological safeguards are a must, digital data storing is always at risk of being breached. Code 1.06 serves that the minimizes of potential for multiple relationships and conflict of interest. It is less likely that therapists and professionals in this field will encounter situations where clients and or family members of the clients view them as more than a professional, and also would be more difficult for therapists to receive gift offers or outside services when ABA services are delivered exclusively online. Code 2.09 serves treatment and intervention efficacy. Telehealth provides the best available communication methods that are individualized per client and evidence-based, just as in-home ABA therapy services would provide. Those are just a few important ethical code highlights to consider. It is important for professionals within the field of ABA to familiarize themselves with all of the BA/CBE compliance codes to ensure effective and ethical treatment delivery at all times. And now we will move on to our frequently asked questions. So our first question is, what is a BCBA's ethical responsibility regarding this topic of telehealth? The BCBA must be sure to comply with ethical codes regardless of service delivery environment, whether it's in-home or telehealth, especially HIPAA compliance, as this is a major concern for many telehealth providers. Our second question was, how have recent world events impacted your thoughts on this topic? So the COVID-19 pandemic has drastically impacted our view of telehealth services. Ideally, face masks and other protective equipment are not helpful when it comes to teaching our clients echoics and other verbal behavior, but they became the new normal, and in many instances, better than resorting to telehealth services for clients who do better with hands-on therapy. Our third question was, is one type of therapy more effective for certain individuals? The type of therapy really depends on the client. Some children require physical prompting and hands-on learning more than others. Some might even do better without the physical presence of a therapist. And finally, do you have any experience with this topic? I have very limited experience with this topic, but as Marvette and Michaela have mentioned that they have telehealth experience. And the next slide is our references.
Well, thank you for joining us in this presentation, and we will close out now. Thank you for watching.